In the late afternoon, around 200 nautical miles off the coast of India, the 23-man crew of the Alot, one of the largest container ships in the world, completes their daily inventory checks. On board are just under 21,000 standard shipping containers with a combined value of over $1.2 billion, on top of the ship itself, which is worth tens of millions of dollars in scrap metal alone. This ship has no defences and no financial attachments to any of the countries it will be sailing past on its 3-week journey, none of whom are direct military or economic allies of the ship's flag state or owner. Its relatively small crew are a mix of nationals primarily from the Philippines, Taiwan, and the Netherlands, all of whom have specifically been trained not to put themselves in harm's way to defend the ship's valuable cargo. The point is that any single navy from any single one of these countries could easily commandeer this incredibly valuable vessel, but they don't. On the contrary, almost all of these countries would use their naval resources to render assistance should this ship, or any other ship for that matter, run into trouble around their waters. Today, we almost take this assumption of safe, free passage for granted. A Taiwanese ship flagged in Panama sailing under a Dutch captain, transporting primarily Chinese-made goods from Singapore to Greece, can sail through Indian territorial waters with practically no fear that it will be attacked along the way, and it can do it completely for free. But it wasn't always like this. In the year 1750, in this very same waterway, global trade was a decidedly more militarized affair. The major global trade companies of the time were pseudo-naval powers in their own right. Merchant vessels were laden with cannons, ships traveled in convoys, and the reason why spices from Asia were such a luxury was because they were pricing in such a risk. In less than 30 years, a few major changes to global economics and colonial-era geopolitics took us from this system of every man for themselves on the high seas to what we have today. Barring a few little interruptions here and there, we've had an almost 200-year run of highly collegial territorial and international waters. Understanding how we've maintained this delicate system, who benefits from it, and most importantly, who pays the price for it, might also reveal why it could be falling apart.
Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, quote, "Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz."
Indonesia is considering taxing ships transiting the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes.
Plays Taiwan responding by mobilizing its troops to rehearse defense tactics.
We will stop the bombings, and they have capitulated, but more importantly, we will take their word. They say they will not be blowing up ships anymore, and I will accept their word, and we are going to stop the bombing.
Okay, so international trade over the world's oceans obviously existed well before the 1800s. But before the system we have today, it really was survival of whoever had the most guns. Individual states would protect the waters directly surrounding them for their own local merchants, but beyond that, sailors were pretty much on their own, and the further out they went, the more dangerous it got. Prize goods like tea, spices, and precious metals eventually gave rise to the major trading companies: the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, the French East India Company, and various other East India companies. They weren't particularly creative with their company names back then, and only a small portion of this trade was done with modern-day India. Back then, the East Indies just meant everywhere in this area broadly east of Europe.
Well, that's fine, because I'm not an Arab.
Well, you're all Arabs to me.
Now, these were technically private institutions. The VOC, founded in 1602, was actually one of the earliest versions of a modern publicly traded company, with real financial shareholders buying and selling stakes in the Amsterdam Exchange. But they also had direct blessings from their respective monarchs to use military force to protect their routes, their ports, their ships, their cargo, and perhaps even their crews, because back then, nobody else was going to do it for them. At its peak, the VOC alone employed around 57,000 people, operated roughly 150 merchant ships, and maintained a private military force of 40 warships and 10,000 soldiers, which, for context, made it a larger naval operation than most actual countries could put together at the time. Now, these companies were ultimately profit-driven entities, and as such they understood that direct conflict was ultimately bad for everybody's business, so there was a lot of agreements about who got what turf. But they were also competitive companies without any of the restrictions around normal, competitive practices today, so when those agreements broke down, disputes were still very much settled with cannons. These organizations also brought in substantial revenue for their respective crowns through taxes and royalties, revenue that was frequently used to fund entirely separate wars back home, which gave rise to a rather creative arrangement known as privateering. A privateer, or corsair if you were feeling French about it, was essentially a private vessel given a formal hall pass by their crown, a letter of marque authorizing them to go out and commandeer enemy merchant ships during times of war. The privateer got to keep the prize of whatever they captured, the crown got to deny their adversary the revenue from that trade, and crucially, if the privateer was caught, the letter of marque technically entitled them to be treated as a prisoner of war rather than a common pirate, which was a fairly meaningful distinction given that the alternative was being hanged. This organized chaos worked for a surprisingly long time, but it should also be pretty clear that none of this was particularly conducive to building the kind of modern interconnected world we have today. What ultimately put an end to all of this though was the balance of power on the water starting to shift rather dramatically. By the late 1700s, the VOC had essentially collapsed under its own weight, overstretched and unable to hold the trade routes it had once dominated. To round things out, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, just a decade and a half later in 1815, left Great Britain as the undisputed naval power on the planet. And with this power, they did something that on the surface seems a little bit counterintuitive. Instead of locking down these coveted trade routes that had been so hotly contested for 200 years, they instead introduced a system that would make international trade free and protected for basically everybody. From 1815, Britain entered into what historians now refer to as Pax Britannica. They used this dominance to keep trade routes open across the world's busiest shipping lanes, suppress piracy well beyond their borders, and even actively police the transatlantic slave trade, with the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron seizing over 1,500 ships and freeing roughly 150,000 people between 1808 and 1860. Critically, they weren't doing this exclusively for themselves. Former European adversaries, smaller trading nations, essentially anyone with a merchant vessel was free to enjoy the safe passage that Britain was paying to maintain. All of this was extraordinarily expensive. The West Africa Squadron alone reportedly consumed around 1.8% of Britain's national income at its peak, and collectively they were spending more on the military than all other major world powers combined, largely because a lot of other European countries could just free ride on the protection Britain was providing. Which raises the fairly obvious question, what was in it for them? Well, believe it or not, the height of the British Empire's commitment to open seas wasn't driven by altruism or humanitarian ideals. It was driven by simple, practical economics. This video is sponsored by Printify. The traditional path of a safe career for life is pretty much over, and honestly, that might be a good thing. For most of history, if you had an idea for a product you wanted to make, you needed a factory, warehouse space, distribution deals, upfront capital, and a serious amount of luck just to get the thing off the ground. Printify makes the entire setup invisible. It's a print-on-demand platform that handles the manufacturing, packing, and shipping for you, so all you actually have to do is come up with an idea. You design a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, anything you always thought should exist, and Printify only prints it when someone actually buys it. No stock to sit on, no upfront cost, no risk of getting stuck with a garage full of unsold inventory. You set the price and keep the margin, and you can test as many ideas as you want until something lands. For some people, it stays a fun side income that pays for holidays. For others, it grows into a proper business they end up running full time. It just takes the risk out of it so you don't need to sell your left kidney just to get started. Use my link in the description to sign up for free and use code MICRO for 15% off your first order. Only the first 100 people get this offer, so act fast. Okay, so the West African Squadron, the fleet dedicated to policing the Atlantic, is a great encapsulation of the Pax Britannica geopolitical dynamics. On the specific objective of policing slavery in the Atlantic, there were two things that the British Empire got out of this arrangement. It was done partially to appease a growing middle-class population back home that was largely opposed to the practice on moral grounds, which, fair enough. But policing slavery in the Atlantic also just meant policing the Atlantic itself, giving Britain an extraordinary degree of control over what was rapidly becoming one of the most important trade corridors on the planet. It also meant that no other colonial power could gain an economic advantage by using slave labour to undercut British production. Though it should be acknowledged that a lot of workers in British colonies at the time were not exactly enjoying lavish conditions either. Additionally, a lot of the people that were freed by the West African Squadron were ultimately redirected to British-controlled territories in places like Sierra Leone, where they would be safer from recapture, but still provided a workforce to the Crown. Additionally, they also got help in these waters from an unlikely ally, the United States, who notably was still 2 decades away from abolishing slavery in their own country, but who saw that the restriction of further trade made their own homegrown slaves more valuable. A pretty grim reminder that economics always wins. Now, without going too far down this particular rabbit hole, the blockade of Africa encapsulated all of the trade-offs in this era. On one side, it let Britain project its power, influence global trade, and bolster its international economic reach. But it also cost a lot and eventually raised questions about who gave them the right to be the world's police. More broadly, enabling international trade for everybody was still overwhelmingly a net benefit to Britain specifically, and the mechanisms through which these benefits flowed are actually worth understanding because they're about to become very relevant again. It might not be what you were expecting, but one of the biggest wins was in the insurance business. International shipping, even back then, needed insurance, and for that, the world increasingly turned to London. Lloyd's of London, which still operates to this day, is not actually an insurance company. It's an insurance marketplace, like a stock exchange, but for insurance contracts instead of shares of a company. Back then, the biggest market segment was primarily ship insurance. The more ships there were sailing in the world's oceans, the more insurance volume would go through London, letting financial speculators share in the profits of international trade without actually having to do the dirty work themselves. Countries would also buy British-built ships, trade through British ports, and increasingly rely on British financial and legal infrastructure to settle their international transactions. What this meant in practice was that by letting everybody trade freely, Britain had positioned itself as something considerably more valuable than just a colonial power hoarding resources. They had become a trading and financial hub that profited from the sheer volume of global commerce flowing through their systems. This was a fundamentally different approach from the old mercantilist thinking of just bringing in as much gold and spice as possible and hoping for the best. These ideas were being supported by some genuinely influential economic thinkers of the time. Adam Smith, who published The Wealth of Nations back in 1776, and David Ricardo, who later developed the theory of comparative advantage, both of whom were staunch opponents of tariffs and trade barriers, and both of whom happened to be very influential men within Britain. Ricardo in particular argued that countries should specialize in whatever they're comparatively best at and trade for the rest, even if one country could technically produce everything more efficiently, and this concept became the intellectual foundation of free trade policy. And if we're being honest, it was also pretty convenient for a country that just so happened to be sitting at the financial center of all this new activity, collecting a nice little fee on the way through. Under this system, the British pound effectively became the world's first de facto global reserve currency. International trade could be settled with reasonable confidence using British currency, British contracts, and British legal frameworks. The fundamental insight was that it was just a lot more profitable to be the center of a thriving ecosystem than to try and dominate a completely stagnant one. Most economic historians broadly agree that these systems made Britain considerably wealthier than it ever would have been by trying to monopolize global trade for itself. Now, the First World War marked the beginning of the end for this whole arrangement. The enormous cost of fighting strained British finances weakened its hold on its colonies, and by the end of the Second World War, the dominant position it had maintained for over a century had effectively evaporated. Britain did manage to hold on to a lot of the financial infrastructure it had built around the world, something to keep in mind for later, but dominion over the world's oceans was now well and truly in the hands of the United States. The US had not had its infrastructure destroyed by the war like Europe had. Its immense industrial capacity was almost entirely intact, and it had emerged as the undeniable new center of global trade, finance, and manufacturing. This was formalized with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which officially pegged the world's major currencies to the US dollar and the dollar itself to gold at $35 per ounce, cementing the fact that the US had picked up the mantle of international economics. The US carried on the tradition of keeping global trade routes open and safe, with a lot of the same economic logic in mind. If global shipping was free and protected, then American companies could export their goods all over the world, and financial markets centered in places like New York would benefit enormously from the heightened activity. This also rather conveniently solidified American power and influence amongst its allies, which was a particularly useful thing to have during the Cold War. Speaking of which, the principle of free maritime passage even technically extended to merchant vessels from the Eastern Bloc. Now, in reality, the Soviets were far less dependent on the maritime trade than the West, but if they did, the US Navy would theoretically be there to protect their right to traverse the world's oceans. These principles were first codified in the Convention on the High Seas in 1958, and then more comprehensively in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which is still the legal framework under which most international merchant trade operates today. UNCLOS is actually a pretty remarkable piece of international cooperation. It formally established the freedom of navigation on the high seas, set a 12 nautical mile limit for territorial waters, created 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones, and guaranteed something called innocent passage, meaning any foreign vessel can transit through another country's territorial waters as long as it does so continuously and without threatening the peace. The details of this agreement are sometimes a bit contentious, especially around military vessels. The USA, in particular, who more than any other nation positions its navy all over the world, likes to argue that innocent passage also extends to naval ships, as per the letter of this law. Other, mostly non-aligned countries have argued this makes it very hard to tell the difference between a carrier strike group innocently transiting their waters and an active invasion, not that it would really matter. These details also get very interesting regarding specific details like nuclear submarines transiting underneath territorial waters. But for the sake of the vast majority of commercial marine traffic, the rules are fairly clear. The ocean is free for anybody to traverse anywhere. UNCLOS even established rules for the deep seabed beyond any nation's jurisdiction, declaring its mineral resources to be the common heritage of mankind. Which sounds almost idealistic until you realize it was mostly a pragmatic move to stop countries from unilaterally claiming the ocean floor. It's the legal architecture that allows a Taiwanese ship flagged in Panama to sail past India without asking anyone's permission, and for the most part it's worked astonishingly well. But of course, rules written on paper only really mean something if there's someone with sufficiently big guns around to enforce them. And for roughly 80 years, that's overwhelmingly been the United States, currently operating a navy on a budget of approximately $292 billion a year, with carrier strike groups capable of deploying to essentially any checkpoint on Earth within days. But a lot of the benefits that have historically justified all that spending have become considerably more questionable in recent years. To maintain these protections across every major ocean, the US has to project military strength at an enormous and ongoing cost, with some of its own naval leadership now calling for defense spending to reach 4% of GDP just to keep up with current readiness demands. And the direct economic benefit the US gets from keeping all these routes open is becoming a lot less obvious to the American voters who are actually paying for it. Roughly 87% of global merchandise trade now takes place entirely outside the United States. The US share of global exports has also been shrinking steadily, raising the reasonable question of whether the world's largest military is increasingly being deployed to protect trade routes that predominantly benefit other countries' economies. Or, put even more bluntly, is the US blowing up its own national debt to fund a navy on the other side of the world so that a Chinese factory can undercut an American one? Now, that's obviously a reductive way of framing it, but it is the version that has resonated with a significant portion of the electorate, and it's aligned with a wider political shift towards regionalization, onshoring, and a general push to get other countries to shoulder a bigger share of their own defense, which in isolation are not entirely unreasonable positions. This has also coincided with the rise of China as the world's dominant industrial power, and critically, the country that now builds a majority of the commercial vessels that actually traverse these trade routes. Chinese shipyards account for over half of global shipbuilding output by tonnage, with South Korean and Japanese yards making up most of the rest. To add further headwinds to an already strained situation, the dominance of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency has been slowly but measurably eroding, and for the first time in roughly 80 years, a major natural waterway has been effectively blockaded and the US Navy hasn't been able to immediately deal with it. Even before the conflict in Iran, there was the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, which has now targeted over 190 commercial vessels since late 2023, forcing many to take the long route around Africa. And then just last month, after seeing the revenue that Iran was raising on the tolls in Hormuz, Indonesia also floated the idea that perhaps they should start charging tolls on ships passing through the Strait of Malacca, which would have been an even more extreme move given that almost a quarter of all global trade passes through that particular waterway. Under fairly extreme international backlash, they were very quick to clarify that it was just a thought experiment, but the fact that a country would even publicly float the idea is probably worth paying attention to. It suggests that a lot of strategically positioned nations are looking at their waterways and doing some maths in a world where the old assumptions of guaranteed free passage is starting to look a little less reliable than it used to be. The other factor worth considering is that the American economy itself has shifted significantly since the days when it needed physical goods crossing every ocean to drive its growth. The US is now overwhelmingly the center of global finance and technology, industries whose products move around the world considerably more easily than actual containers full of physical goods. It's early days yet, and there are plenty of reasonable arguments that the current disruptions are temporary and that the system of free navigation will ultimately survive in some form. But it would be a little bit naive to completely ignore the parallels between what's happening today and what happened the last time this arrangement broke down. The extreme costs, the increasingly questioned benefits, the rising debts, the arguments over who gave them the right to be the world's police, and the growing roster of countries that are no longer content with operating under this dominant power. But there are also some differences. One of the biggest ones today is that if the US does step back from its role as the guarantor of the open seas, there's no obvious country stepping forward to take its place. China is far more interested in regional control than in policing the world's oceans, even though it does the most trade, and Europe, quite frankly, doesn't have the coordination or the spare resources to even attempt it. So if maritime trade does start to become less secure, it probably won't instantly mean cannons strapped back onto every container ship. But the reduced safety would almost certainly show up first in raised insurance premiums, which, if you've been paying attention to the Red Sea and Hormuz situations, is exactly what's already started to happen. These premiums ultimately get passed along in shipping costs, and the incredible cheapness of international shipping is really the thing that's made our entire global economy function the way it does in the first place. Even a basic consumer product often crisscrosses the world dozens of times during its journey through the average supply chain, because saving a tiny amount in manufacturing cost is worth it when the shipping is so comparatively cheap. If a single widget can be stamped out in Vietnam for 3 cents less than it costs in Mexico, a company will happily route it across the Pacific, through the Malacca Strait, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the Atlantic to a warehouse in New Jersey, because the per unit shipping cost barely registers. But if that assumption changes, even modestly, a lot of those supply chains that only make economic sense because shipping is so cheap are going to start centralizing and regionalizing, ultimately passing higher costs on to everybody. And if you want to see this delicate system in action, go and watch this video next as we trace the entire supply chain of a cheap disposable consumer electronic through 8 countries, a dozen ships, and thousands of workers, all the way from raw materials to your doorstep.